Midway through my daughter's vows, her groom pressed a fountain pen into my palm and whispered, "Sign it now, Margaret. Transfer the $33 million your late husband left you into our family trust." Under the white tent in East Hampton, the scent of peonies mixed with salt air as the string quartet faltered and cameras hovered. A leather folder snapped open like a trap, gold letters reading Whitaker and Comer Estate Planning, winking under the fairy lights. My wrist trembled against the satin of my dress, the ink poised above a dotted line that would erase the life my husband and I built. The champagne in my flute went warm in my hand as 100 guests leaned in to watch me bless, or bankroll, the marriage. "Just your blessing," he said, cufflinks catching the light, that country club smile turning into a blade. Emily's mascara shivered as she looked at me, pleading and furious all at once, her bouquet creaking in her grip. The officiant cleared his throat. The notary they'd tucked behind the arbor lifted a stamp like a gavel. "We talked about this." The groom lied smoothly, his cologne, cedar and something expensive, filling the space between us. "I'm Margaret Bennett, 66, and every lesson I ever taught my daughter about trust was being rewritten in real time." The vellum grazed my fingertips, cool and thick, and for a second I felt my late husband's wedding band like an anchor on my finger. A murmur rolled through the tent, the kind that smells like scandal, while a peacock on the lawn screamed at just the wrong moment. My heart pounded against the silk bodice as I weighed love against survival under a sky of Edison bulbs. You want to know how a man I'd known 6 months felt entitled to strip me bare at the altar? I'll tell you how a Saturday brunch at the Plaza, a friendly estate lawyer, and a trust with my daughter's name on it became the prettiest ambush I've ever seen. Because before this pen touched paper, there were coffees, confidences, and a string of for Emily's future conversations that tightened like a noose. I'll show you every red flag I folded into white napkins, every boundary I kept soft for the sake of peace. And I'll show you the moment I stopped being polite and started protecting my legacy and my daughter. If you believe that clear boundaries are the best wedding gift a mother can give, subscribe to follow stories like this. We're just getting started. I am Margaret Bennett, 66, widow of David Bennett, mother of Emily, and the woman holding a pen that felt heavier than our family house ever did in my hand. The tent in East Hampton was white as a sail, slung in perfect arcs that had taken a crew 2 days to raise. The peonies along the aisle breathed sweetness into air already salted by the ocean. And somewhere beyond the shrubs, a peacock let out that sharp, absurd cry that always sounds like someone calling for help. It was all very beautiful, very American summer. Linen suits and pearl studs, the violinist from the quartet frowning subtly because one string had slipped, champagne flutes catching fairy lights. But every inch of the scene felt tight around me, like my bodice was being laced by an impatient stranger. "Sign it now, Margaret," he had whispered, pressing the fountain pen into my palm as if sliding me a favor. "Just your blessing." His cufflinks flashed. Platinum anchors. That country club smile of his softened for any camera that might find it and turned knife-sharp for me alone. Behind him, under the arbor, a notary I didn't know adjusted his stamp. The leather folder snapped open with a sound that matched my pulse. Whitaker and Comer Estate Planning winked in guilt, and the vellum sheets inside glowed under the fairy lights as if they were holy. I had always liked vellum, the weight of it, the way it refuses to be anything but what it is. It took me back to David's office on nights when we were still new to money, when I would sit cross-legged on the floor while he paced, ideas leaping off him like sparks. The first contract that made anything possible had been on vellum, too, the paper cool as milk under my hands when I smoothed it, trying to imagine how life might change. Now, with Emily's bouquet creaking as she tightened her grip and her mascara threatening to betray her, I felt that same surface under my fingertips propose a different future, the erasure of careful, quiet years. We had an audience. We had always had one, really. From kindergarten recitals to venture dinners, there had been eyes. But this felt different. This felt like the whole tent was waiting to see if I had stayed as soft as they needed me to be. 100 guests leaned, and somewhere at the back, I knew the ladies from the club who had watched Emily grow up would be pressing their lips together, so they wouldn't whisper yet. The officiant cleared his throat and glanced at the notary. The groom tilted the pen a fraction closer to me, and in that motion I saw the whole 6 months that had delivered me to this strange, tightrope moment. "Margaret, we talked about this," he said, and his cologne, cedar and polish and something expensive, filled that inch of air you never think will belong to anyone else. He called me Margaret in public, never Maggie, because he knew my name was a habit of my generation, the way a woman like me is worn into family stories. In private, he'd tried Mags once and watched the way I flinched. He'd never used it again, but the message had been clear. He was testing the fence. He knew where the wire was. 6 months earlier, in the palm court at the plaza, I had watched him test it for the first time. We were tucked under the stained glass like we were in a jeweled shell, the harpist plucking something that made older couples turn their heads and younger ones keep talking. I had ordered tea. David always said I was traditional that way, and after he died I kept ordering it because grief makes you a collector of small rituals. Emily's hands had made circles on her napkin, a schoolgirl tell I thought she outgrew after 8th grade, and every time they stopped, the diamond on her finger caught the light as if it wanted me to acknowledge its presence. The man across from me, Graham Whitaker, wore a suit that managed to say both "I work" and "I do not worry." He had that slicked back hair that is more product than hair, and when he told the waiter not to hover, he did it with his eyes. I had met men like him in David's world, at fundraisers and board meetings, the ones who were always first into a revolving door and out again on their feet. He was handsome in that way that photographs well, the kind of handsome that knows how to arrange itself to be believed. "Your Emily is something special," he had said then, and smiled like he had discovered fire. I knew the moment I saw her at that gallery opening. She was carrying a chair for an older woman who couldn't find a place to sit. Who does that in Manhattan? People don't see each other anymore. Emily does. My daughter had glowed. Because she does see people. Because I raised her with casseroles for neighbors, with jars of lightning bugs on July nights, with a basket by the door for shoes so mud stayed outside because we respect what we step into. She is kind in the old-fashioned way, even when the world tries to teach her to be otherwise. When the check came, he reached for it with the casual air of a man who always gets it and enjoys being announced by it. That was the day he delivered his first gift. Not the diamond, that had come later, but an introduction. "On a boring Thursday like this, you shouldn't have to hear about logistics," he said lightly. And he leaned back as a man in an unremarkable suit approached our table with all the ceremony of a waiter. "But there are people you should meet. Friends of my family. They know their way around estates. They take care of our people." A card slid onto the table. Whitaker and Carmer Estate Planning. The serif font tried to look timeless. The card was thick enough to use as a wedge. "I'm not looking to change anything," I said then. Teaspoons clinked like distant bells. "David and I organized everything. We have our lawyer." "And that's wonderful," Graham said, palms up in magnanimous surrender. "I would never rush you. But for Emily's future, it makes sense to have pressure points relieved. Taxes are a beast. Protections matter. A family trust just streamlines things. It keeps the decision-making in the family. We're a family now. We were not a family then. We were a tea and a slow inspection. But Emily squeezed my knee under the table. A hint of dare, a hint of hope. And because I am a woman who learned early that to close a door too quickly is to invite someone to knock more loudly, I smiled politely at the man who had approached, took his card, and tucked it into my bag with the salt packet I had saved from our last trip to Montauk, because David always said those little packets were like treasure, how they appeared when you needed them. When you have loved someone for nearly 40 years, you begin to carry their nonsense on purpose. My days have been small and big in equal measure since David died. Morning swims at the Y kept my morning polite. Laps measured out grief with tile lines and chlorine stings. I walk the reservoir in Central Park when the breeze is right, and say hello to the same dog walkers enough times that eventually we become confidants. To a point. I run the Bennett Foundation with more quietness than people like, because charity to me was always about baked ziti on a doorstep more than a gala with a wall of roses. There's a routine that comes from being needed in a way that is bigger than motherhood, but motherhood is the gig that never retires. I bring banana bread still warm to my neighbor down the hall when her grandbaby is born. I send checks to the school where David started tinkering with code in a lab that smelled like heated dust. I sit at the kitchen table in our apartment and pay bills with the same fountain pen I used to sign our first mortgage, and later, our first check to a hospital wing with his name on it. I have made sacrifices. They look glamorous when you squint. David and I married in a church in Scarsdale with a cake from a bakery that listed the flavors on a chalkboard. He wore rented tails, and I wore my sister's veil. We moved into a walk-up in Murray Hill with a dishwasher that rattled like a train. He worked late. I learned how to code in a version of BASIC so vintage it might as well have been Latin, because we couldn't afford another hire, and his dream had more edges than hands. When Emily came along, I learned to type with her in a sling on my chest. There were nights when the only way dinner happened was because I had a freezer full of meatballs labeled in Sharpie. When the market swung and a contract dissolved, I sold the strand of pearls my grandmother left me. I never told my mother. When David's mother got sick, I moved in with her for a month to keep her company at night, even though the hospital had nurses, because dignity lives in hands that hold yours at 3 a.m. Then came the years the money arrived fast and clumsy. We bought smarter, not bigger. David said we would never be the kind of rich who forgot what a quart of milk cost, and we weren't. But you cannot steer the whole world by your own knuckles. People started assuming that our generosity was a faucet they could reach up and twist at their convenience. And I learned that money doesn't only change people. It changes how people are performed around you. Graham slid into our lives on the back of a New York summer that pretended to be forgiving. He took Emily to dinners where the menus had no prices, and floors so glossy you could see your own anxieties in them. He sent flowers to me on a Tuesday. From one loyalist to another, his card said, because I mentioned dry Januaries and he smiled like we were in on something, and texted me photos of Emily holding up oysters to her grin in Sag Harbor. He was attentive in the practiced way, the way that has improved with feedback. He asked about the Bennett Foundation in a tone that suggested he cared about causes more than optics, and when I mentioned we funded after-school programs in the Bronx that taught kids how to fix bikes, his eyes didn't glaze. He said he'd donate, and he did. He sent a check. He wanted me to see that he knew the moves. He also wanted me to forget the moments in between, the small chips taken out of me like samples of paint. He called the apartment Old World and told Emily they'd probably be in Tribeca in a year, 2 at most. He stepped over my shoes at the door without taking his off. He insisted on paying for groceries after he had insisted on choosing the shop, because Whole Foods is a monopoly, and I want to support the little fish, while gently placing imported peaches into the cart. He suggested I modernize my portfolio. He suggested I needed a more robust team. He suggested the word burden in such tender tones, I nearly thanked him for it. Think of it like this, he said one night, perched on my kitchen stool, as if he had built it himself. When someone offers to carry your bag at the airport, you don't say, "No, I have it, it's my bag." You say thank you. You let them. I'm offering to carry the complicated pieces of your bag. Emily smiled apologetically at me, as if we had discussed this behind the scenes and I was late to rehearsal. She was glowing because she was in love, because he stood when she entered a room and laughed at her jokes in a way that made other men look like amateurs. The night she told me she and Graham were getting married, she sat with her feet tucked under her on my sofa, her nail polish a delicate pink that made her hands look like the ones I kissed when she was an infant. "The wedding will be small," she said. "Family and close friends. East Hampton, because it's where we're happiest. The tent with the fairy lights. I don't want anything absurd." "You have never been absurd," I told her, and with my thumb I wiped a piece of mascara she had missed under her eye. "You've always been clear. Clear can be a blessing. Clear can be a target. There were coffees. There always are. Styrofoam in the park. Lattes in cups so thin I was afraid to hold them. Graham had a friend, a woman in her 40s, polished like a showroom wood floor, who met us at a cafe in Tribeca that aggressively sold pastries without naming them. "Camille," she said, and her handshake was soft, which is always a tell. She was with Whitaker & Co. sometimes, and also with other boutique firms, and she explained trusts with such serenity you'd think we were discussing flower arrangements. Split it this way, and you preserve the legacy. Place it here, and you reduce liabilities. If I set up a family trust with Emily as a trustee, she gently explained, I would be protecting what I loved from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And I noticed how she had placed Shakespeare in her mouth as if he belonged on a brochure. I have an attorney, I said again. The old words, the ones that kept being invited out for coffee without my consent. We've had a plan for years. And it's working, Camille said. Of course, but plans can be updated like software. She smiled at me with enamel that did not crack under pressure. Let's look at this like an upgrade. Graham was more obvious at home. He started calling my bedroom the master, and then correcting himself as if he had caught a slur. He explained TikTok to me as if I were a grandmother in a central casting way, and when I laughed and said I had a burner account, he was surprised. He complimented my lemon bars in a tone that praised a child's drawing. He kept suggesting we do a family holiday in Vale, and when I reminded him that David and I had always gone to Stowe because we liked the way the trees looked up there, he said, We can evolve. Once, at a charity event downtown, he introduced me to a man with a watch I could see from yards away and said, And this is Margaret, Emily's mom, the heart of the operation. We need her in the right headspace for all these transitions. He squeezed my shoulder as if my head was a bicycle wheel. And the tiny bonds, oh, they add up. The use of we in sentences that shouldn't have them. The phrase for Emily's future delivered like a prayer. The not asking, and then the apologizing when I noticed. When he and Emily showed up with a folder and asked if I might sign something non-binding just to get the process started, my hands were busy with a roast chicken, and I asked him to put it on the counter and we never discussed it again, because I knew then that something was being rehearsed around me. It was Emily who told me about the specific plan, though. In my kitchen, 2 weeks before the wedding, while the air smelled like basil, and the Yankees murmured from the radio. She had been chewing her lip, an old nervousness. Mom, it's just a trust, she said, and she looked 12 for a terrible moment. Graham says it's cleaner. The money would be in a place where it works for everyone. You'd be in control. Would I? I asked gently. Because sometimes control is a word like diet, where what it really means is not enough. She flinched at the joke. I rounded the counter and took her hands. They were warm from the stove. I closed my eyes and remembered pressing a cold washcloth to her neck when she had a fever, and the world narrowed to her breaths. You're my child, I said. Everything I have is for you. But you do not have to be the reason I give away the right to make decisions. Graham is your fiancé, I said. He is not your guardian. I am not your ward. I'm your mother. She pressed her forehead to mine. I felt her heartbeat in the space between us. In that moment, I said to myself what I had whispered in various ways since the day she was born. She is good. She is not foolish. But love distorts measurements. She is in a season where love is a magnifying glass and a fog. I made a call to my attorney the next day. Ruth Delgado and I had been drinking out of the same cups for a long time. She sees the cracks in language the way a mason sees hairline splits in marble. We sat in her office on Madison Avenue, where the light is always kinder than you think it will be, and she went over everything with me as if she were teaching me to knit. A stitch forward, a stitch back. Nothing to be hurried if you want to avoid holes. They're either going to push you to sign something symbolic before the wedding, or they're going to try to make the trust a condition of their vows, she said. No drama, just the knowledge of a woman who has seen more variations of this story than I want to consider. They will think they are being subtle, I said. They will be wrong, she said. Protect yourself. Be clear. Do not be cruel. Document more than you think you need to, because memories today are screens that are tired tomorrow. We made some changes. I revised powers of attorney. I moved pieces that had been sitting too long in one place, not to hide anything, but to make sure that if anyone did decide to pry, they would find that the hinges were not theirs. I left in place what David and I had built, because decisions like ours are structures, not costumes. I also had Ruth on speed dial, which is something I never thought I would say about a lawyer. I told 2 friends what was happening, women from choir, not from the club, because they are the ones who arrive on your doorstep without being asked. I told our doorman, Luis, to call security if anyone he did not recognize insisted on a delivery addressed to me, because sometimes harm arrives in a FedEx envelope you didn't order. And then the wedding set itself up like a stage. The tent arrived on a truck that hissed and breathed, like a dragon that had agreed to be parked on a manicured lawn. Emily chose hydrangeas and peonies and frosting that caught the light like a shell. The caterer asked me if anyone had allergies, and I remembered all the birthday parties where I had taped index cards to plates with children's names, and what would cause them to itch. The quartet rehearsed Vivaldi while the chairs thudded into the grass. I slept in a room at the inn where the wallpaper had sailboats that looked like a polite fleet, and I wrote my toast on hotel stationery because I have always been superstitious about writing speeches on ordinary paper. On the morning of the wedding, I went for a walk down to the beach. The sky was the kind of blue that painters consider a challenge. Gulls teased the air, and a couple ran by in matching sneakers, each glancing to see if the other was keeping pace. I walked to the edge where the water licks away footprints and pressed David's wedding band into my palm, the way I do when I want to bring him into the present more concretely than a memory allows. If anyone had asked me then if I was afraid, I would have said no. Fear is loud, and what I felt was quiet. It was resolve, the kind that sits down at a table and unfolds a napkin across its lap. Under the tent, in the cool that the opening created, guests murmured and adjusted their shawls. The scent of peonies was almost too much. The officiant cleared his throat with the seriousness of a man who has written a draft of a kindness and hopes it will survive contact with a crowd. When I saw Emily at the end of the aisle, she was sunlight. Her dress was simple, a column that made her look taller, and her bouquet looked heavy because she had chosen family flowers, the lilacs I planted at the house upstate, the roses she clipped as a teenager, learning not to fear thorns. I had never been so aware of the heart as a muscle. And then the thing I had anticipated arrived, dressed in courtesy. It did not knock. It placed itself into my hand. The leather folder, the pen, the soft, insistent voice, the gleam of that absurd stamp already loaded with ink. "Just your blessing," he said. "It is a strange thing to stand inside your own test." My hand trembled, not because I had any intention of signing, but because I felt, with a surprising grief, the distance between the little girl who brought me dandelion bouquets and the woman standing there, looking at me, pleading and furious, trapped in a moment I knew she had not designed. I understood suddenly that Graham had orchestrated this not only as leverage over me, but as a trap for her. If I refused, I would be painted as withholding, as distrustful, as an old woman clinging to money out of fear. If I signed, I would confirm his thesis, that he could set the frame around any family portrait he wanted. He thought he knew me. He thought the story of me ended with, "She loves her daughter." He forgot that love, in the long run, is not a softness. It is an architecture. I lifted my eyes to his. Up close, I could see the small vein near his temple that popped when he was excited. He had saved lives with that excitement in himself, I imagined. He had probably closed deals with it, gotten out of tickets, charmed waitresses. He had mistaken that for permission to write the end of my sentence. "We can pause for signatures after the ceremony," I said softly, my lips barely moving, as if we were discussing a missing boutonniere. "It seems unorthodox to do it here." "Of course," he said, the pivot smooth, and then he leaned closer, and under the smile that belonged to the tent, he spoke to me like a locksmith does to a door. "But better now. It calms everything. Emily feels calmer when you're on board. This is for her." "Emily," I said, and I turned slightly so that my daughter could see my face and not only his. "Sweetheart, do you want me to sign something right now?" She blinked. 100 guests held their breath like they could help her decide. She swallowed, and the sound of it seemed loud. Graham said it would just be, like, peace of mind. "Peace of mind doesn't require an audience," I said, still gentle. "And my blessing does not require paperwork." Graham's hand tightened on the pen. I saw his jaw move, a small calculation. The notary shifted the stamp. I saw his eyes flick to someone in the second row. a thin man with a slick head I had been introduced to as an uncle. Whitaker & Co. had definitely sent their choir. David used to say that in any meeting, the quiet person at the table is often the one who knows where the documents are. I had brought my own choir, not to sing, but to watch. Ruth sat near the aisle, looking like an ant, an unremarkable fascinator perched on her head. My friend Janine, organist at St. Thomas, sat behind her, a woman who looks like she bakes and actually knows how to draw boundaries like a general. They did not need to intervene. Their presence was its own kind of stamp. I did something then that surprised even me with its simplicity. I put the pen down. It clicked against the edge of the table they had tucked by the arbor, the sound more persuasive than any speech I could have delivered. I breathed. I thought of the countless times I had fed people quietly, the soups that had warmed grief into something manageable. I thought of David's hands on mine when we signed the papers adopting the old lab that someone else did not want. I thought of the night we couldn't afford a taxi, and we walked home across 40 blocks, and we laughed because being poor is bearable if you are walking with someone who thinks you're about to change the world. I thought of the Thanksgiving when Emily spilled the gravy and cried, and how we ate the turkey with butter and it was delicious anyway. "Graham," I said, and I made my voice so gentle you could scoop it with a spoon. I have made many decisions in my life with grace. I am going to make this one too, and I'm going to make it later, in private, with my attorney present, because that is what David and I promised each other we would do. We do not sign under arches. His face passed through several weathers in a moment. Sunny surprise, overcast annoyance, a storm I recognized as the one he kept well behind his teeth. "We talked about this," he murmured again, for me only, as if repetition could retroactively make truth. "No," I said, still sweet. "You talked. I listened. It's different." Emily's shoulders dropped a hair. Relief and fear can look the same when the body releases its hostage. The officiant, bless him, recognized the opening and began to speak, his voice an even rope we could hold. The music rose, the quartet finding its footing. The peacock, as if hired, screamed again from the hedge, ridiculous and true all at once. "It is not a battle to say no if you know where your yes is. My yes is to my daughter, not to anyone's plan for her. My yes is to the honest thing we build when we do not skip steps to impress the audience. But saying no to a man like Graham is not a period. It is a comma. It invites the next clause. He did not push. He did not make a scene. He smiled for the cameras and slid the folder back under the arbor, so deftly you might believe he had changed his mind. He lifted Emily's hand, and the vows resumed their procession. I heard them. Of course I did. Love, honor, keep, the words that outlast wardrobes. The reception after sounded like every happy thing. You know this sound if you have lived a life in this country. If you have stood under fairy lights that make everyone think they are better looking than they are. Glasses chimed, and silverware flashed, and waiters moved like a ballet. My toast was stacked in my mind like plates. I knew when to place the laughter and where to tuck the ache. I spoke about Emily's first day of school, how she had insisted on choosing between 2 hair ribbons, how she had hugged me at drop-off and said, "I'll be brave if you are," and how I had realized then that bravery is contagious. Graham's father, a man with kind eyes and a voice that talked too much about sailing, told a story about his son building tree houses for neighborhood kids that did not ring true because I could not picture his hands holding a hammer. People laughed. People clapped. The cake was cut. The photographer arranged us in configurations that never occur in real life. But when the band took a break, and people drifted to powder their noses and top off their drinks, he found me. He had rehearsed this face too. Worried but not aggressive. Real but still handsome. "Margaret," he said, "I am concerned." "About?" "The trust. You saw the tax projections, right? You saw the upside for the family. I want to make sure we're aligned. I'd hate for this to become a thing. You know how families can be." I sipped water. Champagne felt too volatile. "Families are a thing," I said. "That's the point." He glanced around. No one was obviously watching, and yet we were being watched. That is the paradox of a party. Emily wants you to bless this, he said, lowering his voice further. She thinks your hesitation means you don't approve of us. I do not equate caution with disapproval, I said. I equate it with having learned a few things the hard way. He ran his tongue over his teeth, an unconscious gesture. I worry about timing. Some opportunities are perishable. For instance, my friend at the firm can only hold the terms for so long. Perishable like milk, I said lightly. We'd better refrigerate them. It was not my sharpest line, but it was more sugar than vinegar, and that matters. If I have learned anything about conflict, it is that I can be firm without heat. He frowned, polite. I'm not your enemy, he said. I looked at him then, not through him. It is important to look. He was a man who has succeeded often enough to expect the world to align. He loved my daughter, I think, in the way that men like him love women like her, with admiration and the flat certainty that their love is an improvement on what existed before. He had not intended to humiliate me. He had intended to arrange reality to his liking. I did not say you were, I said, but I have had enemies who smiled at me before, and I have had friends who told me the truth. I know the difference. He inhaled to speak, but my hand was on his forearm now, a mother's grip, not a supplicant's. Listen to me, I said. This is going to go one of two ways. We will, after the weekend, sit with my attorney and yours, and we'll talk like people who respect one another. Or you will continue to press in ways that feel like pressure, and I will make decisions you do not get to be in the room for. Either way, I will sleep at night, because I am doing what I have always done, which is to care for this family with the intelligence God gave me. If that feels like a threat to you, perhaps consider whether you're asking me to be careless in order to be polite. His eyes flared, a flash. You think I'm after your money. I think you're after control, I said. Money is simply the lever you know how to pull. In that moment, a part of me softened towards him, because that is my flaw. He is someone's son. Someone taught him that love is a system with rules you control. He had learned, perhaps, that generosity is a rope you hand to someone else, so that later, they can pull you where you want them. He stepped back. He lifted his glass. He smiled a thin smile. To family, he said. To family, I said, and I meant it. When the night wound down and the younger guests began to remove their shoes, when someone put on a song that made a dozen college friends scream and run to the dance floor, I found Emily in a corner with her shoes dangling from her hand. The makeup artist had done something to her hands, so they glowed in photographs. She looked both exhausted and blissed, a combination I recognized from new motherhood and no other time. Mom, she said, breathless. I'm sorry. No, I said. Don't be. You are learning in real time. We all do. I thought the trust would make you feel included. That is not what it makes me feel, I said. But that is okay. People often do the wrong thing for the right reason. And if what he wants is best for you, he will be able to defend it under fluorescent lights, and not just fairy lights. She leaned into me, her head a weight on my shoulder, the way it was when she was small, and the movie frightened her, and she wanted to watch it anyway. Promise me, you won't let this turn us into a story people tell about a mother who ruined a wedding, she whispered, laughing a little. I can hear the women at the club already. I do not live at the club, I said dryly. I live in an apartment where the radiators still clang, and in a memory where your father laughed so hard at a joke he stole the breath right out of me. We will be the story about a mother and a daughter learning boundaries with their new in-laws without letting it bruise their love. That is a long title, but it is true. The peacock cried again. The night cooled around us. Somewhere beyond the hedge, the ocean exhaled, and I thought, this is how you prepare for a conflict. You do not sharpen knives, you sharpen your definitions. You do not broadcast your strategy at a party. You make soup and pack folders and arrange appointments. You show up later, in a room you can trust, and you speak the language of clarity. When I returned to the inn, the wallpaper boats swam serenely in their eternal regatta. I ran the bath hot, the way I always do when I need to think in a straight line. I placed David's ring on the little porcelain dish by the sink. I thought of the years I said yes, again and again, to things that made our lives better, even when they required giving up something else. I thought of the times I said no and saved our family from choices that would have eroded us. Ruth had texted me a simple red heart during the reception. Nothing else. Nothing dramatic. My choir was humming. In the morning, the wedding would be over, and the marriage would begin. And then the real work would start. The work of teaching someone who believes in his own instruments that in this family, consent is not a hoop you hold up and ask me to jump through because it's festive. It is the hinge on every door. I could already picture the next scene. A conference room with a view of Midtown that made people walk taller. Pens that were placed in front of us without fanfare. Camille, with her perfect enamel, sitting silent, while an older man with tired eyes explained things that needed a younger voice. Ruth, calm as a church pew. Emily, with a notepad, scribbling lines so she could look back and make a decision she could live with. Graham, performing patience because he has been told it is attractive. Me, quiet, because quiet is my power until it isn't. I planned to bring lemon bars. People talk differently when there are lemon bars. It is a ridiculous trick that is also true. I turned off the bathroom light and let the room absorb me. I thought then, because my brain will always go where it wants before sleep, of the time David and I decided to spend our first bonus not on a vacation, but on a new boiler for the building, because the old one rattled, and the super had 3 kids, and the last 3 winters had been miserable. "We'll take sunsets later," he had said, and we did. I thought of the day we signed the papers that funded the scholarship in his name, and how the superintendent of the school had cried, and then pretended he hadn't. I thought of Emily, 9 years old, hands covered in paint, looking up at me at the kitchen table and saying, "Do we have enough?" And me saying, "We always do, because we know what that means." I thought of how, when I was little, my father kept a mason jar on top of the refrigerator with change in it for unexpected pies, emergencies that were also joys. The ring on the dish looked like a small planet. I slid into the bed and listened to the building breathe around me. Somewhere, another mother was closing her eyes and hoping her child would make a good life. Somewhere, another man had decided to test a woman's fence. Somewhere, a bird that should not be in this climate made a ridiculous cry in a hedge beside the sea. In the morning, I would go for a walk, and perhaps I would buy bagels for anyone who wanted them, and I would text Ruth with 2 times that would suit. I would call Luis and ask him if he could water my plants while I was out, because I am still a person who worries about plants. And when Graham tried to corner me again, because he would, I would remember that the story of me is not that I loved my daughter. That is the foundation. The story is that I knew when to make the door stronger and when to make the room brighter. My blessing isn't ink. It's the roof. If he tried to push this into ugliness, I would be ready. He could bring a notary and I would bring the truth. He could bring a folder, and I would bring everything David and I had already built and written and lived. He could bring the kind of audacity that looks like confidence, and I would bring the kind that looks like a woman with her shoes on, standing steady. And Emily, my Emily, would see the difference. That is what I wanted most. Not to win, to model. The ocean kept breathing beyond the hedge. The fairy lights outside my window blinked and rested. Somewhere, someone was washing peony water out of vases. I closed my eyes and pictured the kitchen table, the one that has crumbs in a groove I cannot find. I pictured a pen that belongs to me. I pictured a dotted line, and the hand that refuses to let fear sign my name. The morning after the wedding, I woke with the ocean already in my ears, like a promise kept. The boats on the wallpaper were still racing nowhere, and the porcelain dish beside the sink held David's ring, a small planet catching the thin East Hampton light. I slid the ring onto a simple chain I'd brought from home, one of those cheap gold ones you find at a pharmacy when what you want is actually courage. I wore it under the scoop neck of my blouse, so it rested at that hollow just below the throat, where the body keeps its secrets. It was not jewelry so much as ballast. In the pocket of my bag lay my own fountain pen, the one with a small crack near the cap from the time it fell off the kitchen table during a thunderstorm and rolled under the stove. David bought it for me the year the foundation funded its first full scholarship. He said it was time I signed things with something that felt like it could bear weight. He had his pen, and I had mine. Yesterday, Graham had pushed his sleek instrument into my hand, as if his ink had better intentions than mine. When I clicked my pen open that morning to test it on the hotel stationery, just a looping M and a dot where I meant to put one, it scratched in a familiar way. That scratch was the sound of my hand remembering itself. I dressed in a pale blue I know photographs well, and walked down to the edge of the property where the lawn gives up and lets the dunes have their say. A mother and daughter were combing the tide line for shells, and the little girl kept shouting, this one, even when her hands were empty. A dog ran ecstatic circles around a man holding coffee. The peacock from the night before appeared as if on cue, its neck a ridiculous jewel rising from the green. It blinked at me like a witness. Somewhere behind me, kitchen staff unloaded boxes of bagels and smoked salmon for the brunch, and I could already smell the dill. East Hampton pretends it quiet, but it is full of fussing. I thought of how many times in my life decisions had been made at breakfast. When to downsize an office we couldn't afford. When to add a second instructor to an after-school program because 20 kids had turned into 40. When to call my mother and tell her the test results weren't terrible. They were just a different map. The room after a wedding is always that kind of morning. All glitter swept to the corners, and reality taking off its shoes. It is the right time to write a thing down and decide who you are. As if summoned by that private word, my phone buzzed. A text from Ruth. In the city by 11. Can do 3 p.m. meeting. Can you be at my office by then? And under that, a second message. Also, we can do what we discussed. I have everything drafted. Proud of you. I had not told Ruth about the notary behind the arbor yet. I hadn't needed to. Some people you know will read between the boats on the wallpaper. I typed back, yes to 3 p.m. We'll be there with lemon bars if the AC is working. And then, because I am a person who believes in over-preparing with kindness, I added, please put on your calm face. He will try to perform anxious charm. I tucked the phone into my bag with the pen and the small salt packet I keep for reasons that are probably ridiculous to anyone who wasn't married to David. He used to collect them like tokens, a belief that if you keep a little salt on you, nothing bland can sneak into your life. The packet crinkled when my hand brushed it, a whisper of every diner breakfast we ever ate, every takeout order where we argued over whether coleslaw is ever worth eating. It's absurd, I know, to carry around a square of salt like a talisman, but grief makes rituals out of nonsense, and sometimes it makes sense out of them later. By the time I walked back up to the tent, the brunch was already bright with conversation and the kind of laughter that sounds like relief. The peonies were wilting beautifully in their glass vases, their edges frilling into gold. The quartet had traded Vivaldi for jazz, and their pianist was playing something that made the servers move more loosely. There were platters of blintzes and bowls of berries trying very hard to look casual. This is the American summer party at its most fluent. People who have always known their way around a buffet line. I found Emily near the coffee urns, her hair in a low knot, her dress a simple cotton that made her look younger. The roses in her cheeks that yesterday were made by a makeup brush were today made by sleep and sun. When she saw me, her mouth eased in that way it does when she wants to bury herself in the crook of my neck. Instead, she took my hands. "Mom, last night," she began, and stopped. I squeezed. "I know. We'll talk this afternoon. I have a 3 o'clock with Ruth. Come with me if you want. Sit and listen. Ask questions. Bring a pencil." She looked behind me automatically, a reflex she will learn to unlearn. "Graham is worried," she said softly. "He said if we go to your lawyer without giving Whitaker & Co. a heads up, it'll look adversarial. He wants us all to be on the same page." "I like honesty on a fresh page," I said. "It is easier to see the crossed-out lies." Her mouth tugged into a smile she bit back because she is generous like that. A server poured coffee for us without asking, and then drifted away in that East End fashion, which is to say as if we all live in a movie. Before I could say anything else soothing, Graham approached. Hands in his pockets the way men do when they want to look non-threatening, but also want to control the furniture. "Good morning, ladies," he said. The honey in his voice warmed for the assembled. How did we all sleep? I slept like a person whose daughter married, I said. Which is to say, not at all, and entirely. He laughed in the right key. We've got a small logistics thing to tidy up, he said, lowering his tone. The notary is still here, bless him. We can grab 5 minutes before the speeches. Just something symbolic. A little ribbon on the bow. There it was again. Ribbon, bow, blessing. As if paper were morality. He had a glass of orange juice in his hand and somehow held it like it was evidence. Graham, I said, why would we do that? He glanced at Emily, and she read it as a sign to participate. Her nickname for him, which I had never quite gotten used to, slid out. Gray, maybe we should just wait. He pressed his lips together in a line that wanted to be patient. It's not a big thing, he said. It's just a memorandum that says we intend to place the assets in a family trust in the next 90 days. It would calm the chatter. What chatter? I asked quietly. The usual, he said with a shrug. There's talk in families after a wedding. It might be nice for everyone to know we're unified. When a person offers you unity as a way to speed past your own consent, you have to listen to the hiss under it. I looked at my daughter, who looked back at me with eyes that were pleading for this not to become a story she dreaded hearing about herself at bridge tables and on the treadmill. I'm going to say this again, in daylight, I said, keeping my voice so gentle that the coffee didn't ripple. I am not signing anything in a tent, at a brunch, or near a buffet. I am signing papers in an office with my counsel present because that is what sane people do. If that doesn't suit you, adjust your expectations, not my location. He stared at me, as if he wanted to move a chess piece with his mind. Then came the first small humiliation of the day, delivered with a smile. Of course, he said loudly enough for a few nearby guests to hear. We want to make sure Margaret is comfortable. Changes are hard at this stage. He winked at a woman I had been introduced to as his aunt, a movement so slight and rehearsed it probably wouldn't show up in photos. I watched the aunt's eyes slide over me like a scanner. Oh, honey, she said, slipping her hand into the crook of my elbow with the faux intimacy of someone who buys candles as personality. Our lawyer is just so good with older clients. He explains things in story form. You'd love him. He can meet you at home so you don't have to schlep. The word older landed on me like a sequin. Too light to argue with and yet pointed. I just walk the dunes, I said, smiling. I'll manage the schlep. I turned to Emily. 9:30 pickup. Train at 10:30. We'll be in the city before lunchtime. Graham's smile sharpened in the corners. Always the planner, he said. Okay, Margaret. We'll table it. He didn't table it. He moved the table closer. The second small humiliation arrived disguised as organization. Place cards that had migrated so that I was seated not at the family table, but at one with distant friends of his mother, women who wanted to tell me about their Pilates instructors and their sons' startups. One of them asked me if I had considered a young, hungry firm to house my assets so they don't feel lonely. Another used the phrase old money, and then apologized when I arched an eyebrow, because I have always been quite clear that our money is middle-aged at best. I excused myself under the pretense of needing more locks, and walked to the edge of the tent where the ocean view cut the air into pieces. There, camouflaged behind an arrangement of ferns, sat the leather folder, its gold letters so familiar now they felt like a song stuck in my head. Next to it, tucked without shame underneath a cloth napkin, was a thin stack of branded papers, Bennett Whitaker Family Trust, printed as if the world had already agreed. A delicate ribbon in navy held them together. It was all very thoughtful. A small altar at the edge of the morning where I was expected to bring my offering. Something inside me, that old yes that raised money and a child and belief, flexed like a muscle you've forgotten you still have. But alongside it rose a different current, the one I hadn't always allowed in. The flow of all the little cuts of the last 6 months pressed their fingers into my back. He had corrected my language at dinner when I spoke about grants, replacing my word neighbors with underserved communities, as if compassion requires a buzzword to be credible. He had told a volunteer at the foundation that we would be refreshing the board, without mentioning it to me first, And the poor woman had told me at a coat drive in the Bronx because gossip is a kindness when it's the only way to deliver the truth. He had introduced me as Emily's mom to a donor I had courted for 2 years, letting my name fall into the background like a piano player at a restaurant. He had moved my place at the rehearsal dinner 3 seats down without asking, something about balancing the table, and then said he'd done it because I'd be more comfortable with the ladies. He had told the band leader to shave 5 minutes off my toast, and told the bartender to suggest I switch to water because weddings are long and sometimes older ladies don't know their pace. I have never been an angry drunk in my life, and I am not accustomed to being managed like a fragile heirloom. In every one of those moments, I had done the civilized thing because civilized is how I was raised, and also how I enjoy myself. I had allowed someone else to fold the napkin of my boundary into a swan and place it on a plate, and I had thanked them because the swan was neat. But those little paper birds add up. They multiply like origami in a drawer until they crowd out your forks. Across the tent, Ruth's text glowed on my phone. We can do what we discussed. We had talked weeks ago about moving a portion of the assets out of the storyline entirely, not as a punishment, not to hide, but to keep the promises David and I had made to ourselves when money first introduced itself as a character in our marriage. An immediate additional endowment to the foundation to secure a pipeline of programs for 5 more years, no matter how winds shifted. A separate, irrevocable trust for Emily alone, managed by an independent trustee, designed so that it remained her separate property under New York law, protected from marital claims, from lawsuits, from bad weather, guardrails that would allow generosity without letting anyone else claim the steering wheel. We had considered doing it quietly, on a Tuesday, because that is my instinct. Quiet is my favorite room. But quiet has relatives. One of them is complicit. One of them is exhausted. And one of them is very, very small. I stood there, the leather folder like an invitation to a party I didn't want to attend. And I felt the ring on my chest, the salt packet in my bag, the pen beside them, the weight of a life built with a man who hated spectacle and loved integrity down to its nails. Graham had thought to bring a notary into a vow. He had thought to ask me to turn a sacrament into a transaction, and then call me sentimental if I didn't obey. I felt the word then, not an expletive, but an exhale. Enough. I walked back to the table where Emily was fielding congratulations with that graceful half-curtsy she has always had. I touched her elbow. "Sweetheart," I said, "will you come to the city with me? I want you in the room when I do what I should have done last month." She glanced at Graham, who had joined a conversation about someone's new house in Palm Beach, while watching us with that hawk peripheral vision of his. "He wanted to do a toast at noon," she said. "Thank people." "We'll be gone by then," I said. "He can thank them without me." Her laugh, small and incredulous, escaped. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Bring a sweater," I said, because habit is a poem we live by. Ruth's office is always cold. We were almost to the exit when Graham intercepted, moving with that friendly speed that makes your path feel like it was his idea. "Heading out?" he asked, his eyes bright in a way that said he was already editing a narrative. "We're going into the city," I said. "Don't wait on us for speeches." He tilted his head. "Today?" He laughed in disbelief that was sweetened to palatability. "The day after your only daughter's wedding?" "Exactly," I said, when the story is still fresh in everyone's mouth. A few heads turned. "There is a way to raise your voice without raising it." He stepped closer, a whisper edged with orange juice. "This is not a great look," he said. "People will assume things. Why make a scene when we can handle it with discretion?" "Because a scene was made around me," I said. "A notary behind an arbor is a scene. A leather folder under hydrangeas is a scene. A speech about family that had a footnote I was supposed to sign is a scene. We will be discreet in the office where decisions belong. But here, I'll also be clear." He blinked as if the light had changed on him unexpectedly. "Margaret," I held up a hand. Not to shush, but to pause. "Do your toast," I said. "Tell your stories. Have your brunch. We will catch the train and meet you back at the apartment." "Oh," he said, recovering, his smile resetting. "We'll swing by later. We should all talk." "You're welcome to visit your wife," I said, gentler than I felt. "My door is always open to my daughter." There it was, a small, neat line laid on lawn like tape before a parade. He looked at it, then at me, and made a show of ignoring it. "Of course," he said. "You know I adore Emily. I am just trying to make this easier." "Easier is different from better," I said. "See you tonight." On the ride to the station, the driver kept the radio on low, the way men from Queens do when they like background heat. Emily held my hand like a girl at a crosswalk. "Is this where I pick a side?" she asked, and I could hear every divorce I've ever comforted a friend through get up from its chair. "No," I said. "This is where you pick a seat. Right next to me, with a pen, with questions, with your eyes wide open and your mouth brave. We are not fighting. We are building a railing." The train hustled toward the city through stretches of marsh and the occasional stubborn American flag. We shared a bagel and a bottle of water because we are practical people. Emily read the drafts Ruth had sent to my phone and underlined words she didn't like. Distribute, sole discretion, spendthrift, corpus. She circled trustee and wrote next to it, in a handwriting that has not changed since 5th grade, "Who?" We decided, on the train between stations with names I cannot hear without thinking of Mets games and diner pie, that it would not be me. It would be someone who knew how to say no to her because they were not struggling under the weight of loving her too much. Ruth's associate, a woman named Dana with eyes like truth, would be asked. If she said no, we'd ask Janine. The thought of Janine, who can say no to a bishop and a bride in the same afternoon in order to protect the liturgy, made me feel like we had a future no one could mess with. At Ruth's, the air conditioning was, as predicted, Arctic. She always keeps a bowl of wrapped peppermints on the table like a godmother. I put the lemon bars down by the printer because people do talk differently with lemon bars, and one should never neglect an advantage. Ruth wore navy in a way that said eternal. She hugged Emily and gave me a look that was a conversation. We read, we adjusted. We put in a line that made me breathe easier. This trust is the sole and separate property of Emily Bennett. No spouse or future spouse of the beneficiary shall have any access to, claim upon, or managerial control over the trust's assets or distributions. We added a clause I suggested, and Ruth liked so much she smiled with her whole face. The governing principle of the trustee shall be to discourage coercive influence from any non-beneficiary. We moved into motion what David and I had always said we would do when the day came when a person who enjoyed the scent of cedar would mistake it for the smell of permission. Then Ruth slid across the table the document that would endow the foundation with an additional sum, numbers on a page that represented after-school programs, and books in hands, and apartments that wouldn't lose their heat in February. It would also, incidentally, take a bite out of what remained in my personal ocean, which would make Whitaker and Cota's projected currents less inviting. "Margaret," Ruth said, "you are signing this because it is a good decision, not as a move in a game." "Yes," I said, "and because the game frightened me into remembering what I already knew." She nodded. "Good." Emily watched my hand as I reached for my pen. For a second, I pictured the green lawn, the arch, the stamp that had hovered like a gavel. I pictured my hand being guided by someone else's narrative. And then I placed David's ring on the table beside the paper, a small planet orbiting the thing that mattered, and I clicked open my own pen. The scratch of the first letter made a sound that felt like a window opening. I signed my name the way I always do, the way he had. It is a signature that knows its own slopes. We all exhaled. Ruth made a copy. Emily ran her finger under the ink like a child memorizing. "Do you want to tell him now?" Ruth asked, not looking at me because looking at me would have made it patronizing. "Yes," I said. Not to gloat, to be very clear. "How public?" Ruth asked. "His tactics were public," I said. "My clarity can afford to be. But I will keep us clean. No names that don't need to be named. No drama as entertainment. Just truth as a boundary." On the cab ride back to the apartment, we stopped at Zabar's because life requires small comforts even when it is on a hinge. I bought chopped liver because my grandmother's ghost still stands at the deli counter in my head, saying you never know when someone will come over hungry. I bought rugelach because if a conversation is going to be difficult, it ought to be sweet at the edges. In the elevator, I told Luis in 3 sentences that we might have guests. He nodded and said he liked my blouse, which is the kind of dignity I want to live around. We got home before Graham. Emily wandered from room to room, touching the things that make a childhood a museum. The crooked candlestick from a Vermont flea market, the framed program from the first gala we ever pulled off, the water stain on the ceiling like a map. She picked up a photo of David holding her in a pool, both of them in ridiculous goggles. He would have loved him, she said, the hope in her voice making me love her in a way that nearly doubled me over. He would have loved your bravery, I said. The doorbell rang. Graham's face through the peephole was arranged to be the kind of face you want to open a door to. I did. He kissed Emily on the cheek and looked at the grocery bag on the counter. Brunch number 2, he said brightly. Always, I said. He took in Ruth's card on the table, the lemon bars we had not yet touched, and the single sheet of paper I had left there on purpose, a copy of the letter I intended to read. He lifted it before I could stop him, because men like him touch paper as if it belongs to the air. He read the first line and set it down with a smile that did not make his eyes smaller, which means it wasn't a real one. You wrote something, he said. Is this for us? For all of us, I said. Will you sit? He did. Emily sat between us, the safest impossible place. I did not stand. I did not want to look like a judge. I picked up the pen. I put the salt packet beside the letter. Ridiculous. Because when the world's tide is high, I like to remind myself we can flavor it ourselves. This morning, I began. We stood under the same tent we stood under yesterday, and the same flowers and the same music tried to convince us that what happens at a wedding is only beauty. But something else happened under that tent. A notary stood behind an arbor. A folder waited behind ferns. A pen, yours, was placed in my palm. I am naming it not to embarrass, but to understand it. I will not let a quiet intimidation turn to fact, because we all pretend it was polite. He opened his mouth, but I held up the ring at my throat with one finger, that small planet catching light, and that was enough to make him wait. Sometimes grief has more authority than any judge. Here is what I did today, I continued, and I kept my voice so soft we had to lean in. I went to my attorney. We endowed the foundation further, so that the work does not have to ask permission from anyone who wasn't there when we made promises. We established a trust for Emily that belongs only to her, one that protects her from the whims of markets and marriages and men. It is not a commentary on you. It is a commentary on the world, and the way I know it treats women when they are tired or trusting. Graham's smile went colder. So you moved the money, he said. You went around me. I did what I have the right to do, I said. And I am telling you now, to your face, because I respect you enough not to let you hear it at the club in a different tone. I am not putting assets into a family trust managed by your people. If at some point in the future I decide to create a vehicle that includes you and your last name, it will be because you have earned it by showing yourself trustworthy over time, not because a notary waited for me at an altar. He stood up, and then thought better of it and sat again. His hands moved. There are moments when a person's fingers betray their brain. You're being dramatic, he said gently. You're overreacting. This was supposed to be simple. I'm sure it was supposed to be, I said. A performance is simple when everyone knows their lines. I've never been good at reading cues I didn't audition for. I don't know why you're punishing Emily, he said. She is the one who loses here. Emily inhaled. I don't, she began, and then she stopped and turned to me. Mom, what do I lose? The illusion that someone else should make hard things easy, I said, which is a loss I want for you more than I want most things. Graham's face changed then. Something in him, perhaps the part that grew up with a father who loved him enough to teach him to sail in angry weather. Perhaps the part that knows optics as oxygen. Perhaps the part that recognizes power when it is clean. Decided to try another way. What if we bring in a neutral third party? He said. We can set up. We already did, I said. She wears navy and keeps mints on her table. You'll like her office. It looks at the Chrysler Building and makes everyone behave." He laughed truly, because that image is irresistible. Then, more softly, the most honest thing I had yet heard him say, "I don't like feeling on the outside of something I thought I was being invited into. This is my family now, too." "Then act like family," I said. "Family doesn't spring traps. Family doesn't tuck papers under flowers. Family doesn't test a woman's fence while calling it a beau." A long quiet settled between us, the kind that in a marriage means a decision has been made, and in a negotiation means someone is calculating the cost. He met my eyes and didn't look away. This is also a kind of respect. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Time," I said. "Consistency. 100 small moments where you choose decency over convenience. Apologies that do not require justification. Deeds that make the people who work for me feel safe, not scared. Learn the names of the kids who bring their bikes to the shop we fund. Take off your shoes when you come into my house. Bring your own pen to your own life, and stop trying to write with mine." His mouth tilted. "And if I do all that, then someday you'll trust me with the money?" "If you do all that," I said, "someday I won't have to think about money when I think about you." He looked at Emily. She looked at him. There it was, the part of this I cannot manage, the inside of a marriage that does not belong to me. She took his hand, and then took it back and placed it on the table beside the salt packet. "I married you because I love you," she said, and the ease of her voice undid me a little. "I didn't marry you because my mother loves money." He laughed again, thin this time. "Your mom is very protective of the right things," she said. We sat there with Zabar's deli men waiting patiently in a bag for their moment, and the city traffic taking its turn at the light outside like an orderly rebellion. He finally nodded, a small bow to an arrangement that had been offered and wouldn't become more attractive with delay. "Okay," he said, "no more tents, offices only, and I will take off my shoes." "Good," I said. I wish that had been the end of it. A calm conversation, and the slow, steady bettering of a man so thoroughly that someday the story I tell is one about growth. Life, however, is more inventive than that. People talk. Whitaker and Comer called me before dinner. Camille's soft voice now lined with concern. "We heard there was some miscommunication at the wedding," she said. "We'd love to get on your calendar." "Then you heard wrong," I said. "There was a communication. Consider this my reply. I'm not moving my assets into any vehicle that you manage. Please remove me from your outreach list." "May I ask why?" she said, polite as a glass door. "Yes," I said. "Because the first time your firm approached me, it did so with a man hidden behind flowers and a stamp that didn't belong near vows. You mistake consent for theatrics. We are not aligned." I hung up gently and put my phone face down, because sometimes the only way to keep a boundary from fraying is to take away the audience. That night, when the dishes were washed and the peacock's cry existed only in our memory, I printed the letter I had written and placed it in an envelope. I did something I had not done since David died. I went downstairs and asked Luis if I could borrow a strip of tape. He gave me the brown kind that rips unevenly. I taped a copy of the letter to the inside of my pantry door. It was not for anyone else. It was for the version of me who might one day, tired or grieving or generous to a fault, consider forgetting. The letter began, "Your blessing is not ink," and ended, "Remember who taught you that." The object symbolo of that day, in the end, was not the ring, not the pen, not even the salt packet. It was a piece of paper with my name on it, signed with my own scratch, taped to the place where I store food. It felt correct that the reminder lived near sustenance. The days that followed were not cinematic. There were errands and an email to the board and a note to the peonies florist, because gratitude is part of any armor. There were calls I did not take, and one I did, from Graham's mother, who asked to meet me at the plaza as if we were going to perform a reparation ritual under stained glass. I met her there because I am not afraid of rooms. She cried and said she had raised her boy to be better than this, and I believed her even as I didn't. She said, "We got caught up," and I thought of ferns and folders and the ambition in paper. "I will always treat you with respect," I said. "But I will not sign anything to be liked." "I see that," she said, a smile somewhere in her tears. And then the small human thing that made me remember we are all learning. "Do you have your lemon bar recipe?" "I do," I said. "I'll send it." When Graham and Emily came for Sunday dinner, he took off his shoes at the door without being asked. He brought a pie from a bakery that is always out of my first choice by the time I get there. He listened when I talked about the reservoir and about a new teacher at the bike program who was also a poet. When he complimented my roast chicken, he did it like a person who has burned his own. He also slipped, twice, into language that made me wonder if quiet would become complicit again. "We'll fix that," he said about a grant application that needed work, and I can make some calls. He said about a donor who hadn't returned one. I watched Emily watch him. I watched him catch himself and apologize without a parenthetical. We are all learning. He has not brought me another leather folder. No more notaries have appeared in rooms where flowers pretend to be more important than vows. When he and Emily talk now about financial things in front of me, he uses the word ask more than the word explain. When we disagree, he no longer wields the phrase "for Emily's future" like a magic wand. He speaks about his own past, the way his father kept the books in a lunch pail, the way he learned to count on what he could carry. He and I will never share a language for salt, but we might eventually share a kitchen. The hardest part has been the whispers. People love a wedding disaster, and when there isn't one, they still enjoy telling it that way. "She refused to sign," someone said at the club, and my friend from choir told me it was okay because the spinach quiche was good that day. "She embarrassed him," said another, and someone else said, "or she spared her daughter." It lessens, day by day. In the city, people have the decency to look forward. New York forgets you in the gentlest ways if you let it. Sometimes I take the chain from around my neck and press the ring into my palm so that the imprint stays there for a few minutes after I open my hand. Sometimes I take down the pantry letter and read it, and sometimes I don't. More often than not, I catch my pen under a bill or a thank you note, and I pick it up and hear that scratch and know there are still things I get to decide. The tent in East Hampton is long gone. The lawn has grown back over the places where the stakes went in. The peacock has, I hope, found another event to witness inappropriately. The notary returned to a life of stamping what belongs to him to stamp. Whitaker & Co. has surely found another family to tell a story to. Perhaps they will choose better places for their props. My daughter is married. She is the same person, and not as it should be. She keeps a notebook now in her purse where she writes down questions to ask people who want something from her. Last week she texted me a photo of a page that said simply, "What's your hurry?" She is learning to like the pace of her own decisions. I kept the salt packet in my bag. It is still absurd, and still somehow right. The morning after the wedding, when Graham pushed a pen into my hand, what he forgot was that I already had one. It isn't a weapon. It is a tool. It is how I sign permission slips and condolence cards and the checks that build rooms where kids fix bikes in the summer. The day he tried to take $33 million with a smile and a stamp, I didn't need to be a warrior. I needed to be a woman with her shoes on, a ring against her skin, a pantry with tape, and a pen that knows its way across a page. That was enough. That will always be enough. The weeks after I taped that letter to my pantry door were quietly revolutionary. They were ordinary in all the ways that count. Laundry, board reports, an unexpected call from a teacher whose class had been saved by a grant, and extraordinary in the way the small decisions I had made radiated outward like pebbles dropped into a pond. People began to treat the new currents in our life as simply the water running where it had always been meant to go. At the foundation, the additional endowment changed things faster than any press release ever would. We were able to guarantee scholarships for another cohort of students, hire a second program director so the bike repair classes could expand to include a summer internship, and finally replace the dented shipping container that held our donated helmets. The kids in the program painted a mural on its side that reads, in block letters, "Ride On." Seeing spray paint and helmets and the faces of teenagers who found their rhythms in wrenching spokes made my chest feel the way it does when the violinist hits the note that makes the whole quartet lean in. Complete, small, right. Board members called me with the awkward commodity of gratitude. Donors who had been considering larger gifts suddenly had a steadier heartbeat. Some asked questions about the legal structure I had put in place, curious because they'd never seen a donor build a moat for generosity before. Others called to say they trusted me, not because I was careful with money, though I am, but because I had kept our promises visible. One longtime supporter sent a note that began, "You showed us how to love without losing ourselves." And then, with a little apology written in the margins, added, "And I am ashamed I hadn't thought of it sooner." Whitaker and Comer did not go away politely. Their calls came in the mornings, curt and curated, and then tapered as their scripts met the wall I had quietly constructed. Camille left a voicemail that read like a brochure refusing to accept that someone might refuse the guided tour. I had a momentary thrill imagining her arriving at my kitchen for lemon bars. Instead, we filed the calls and turned our attention to the things that would outlast phone messages. People who always assumed money made you invisible began to discover that money can, instead, buy you the autonomy to be ordinary. To buy groceries for a neighbor without a press statement, to fund a poetry teacher because poems fixed more things than I had expected. Graham called fewer times than I anticipated. At first, there was the jitter of defensiveness. He would send a text that pretended to be a joke and then wait for a reaction. Then he began to call with reports. He had attended a meeting of the Donors' Council and listened. He had volunteered at a habitat build and shoveled. He had returned a grant email himself, not on my behalf, but as a citizen who understood what those programs meant. These were small things, and small things are the scaffolding of change. When he came to help at one of our weekend bike clinics, he showed up in jeans and a baseball cap, no cufflinks, and he left with grease on his knuckles, and a grin that had the honest grit of someone who'd actually tightened a bolt. The most important consequence of all was how Emily changed. She didn't become someone else overnight. She still laughed with the same sudden joy and cried at the same sad commercials. But she carried herself with a new kind of steadiness, as if the notebook she had started keeping in her purse had become an instrument of care rather than a talisman against mistakes. She asked questions that were precise and practical. Who is the trustee? How are distributions approved? Who will sign the checks if she is abroad? She sat with Ruth and Dana in meeting rooms and took notes that were ruthless in their usefulness. The first time she called me from a board meeting to ask about a clause in a grant agreement, I felt proud in a way that is its own kind of warmth, like hot bread taken right from the oven. There were softer shifts, too. Emily and Graham began to establish patterns that contained the humility of someone learning to be inside another person's family. He stopped correcting the names of the kids at our programs, one of those small but telling abrasions, and learned them instead. He took on, unasked, the chore of bringing a folding ladder to the community center so the lights could be strung for the winter fundraiser. One Saturday, he came to the reservoir with Emily and me, and sat quietly on a bench while I swam my laps. When I climbed out and handed him a towel, he met my eyes and said without preface, "I'm trying to be better." It was both small and enough. Not everything smoothed at once. There were still nights when I found myself reading the pantry letter before I went to bed, as if the tape at the edge of paper could act as a seatbelt against old complacencies. Gossip lets itself bloom where deeds do not, and the club ladies, bless their nimble tongues, had plenty to say about a woman who would not be theatrical. The chorus of commentary was a kind of background noise I had learned to ignore when David was alive. Now I let it wash past me. I have always preferred the company of people who fix bikes and stock library shelves to those who measure character by a dress code. Those were the voices I listened to when doubt crept in. The pen, my pen, became more and more the symbol people noticed. Not the sleek little thing Graham had offered as an instrument of persuasion, but the one with the hairline crack that fit my thumb just so. People would accidentally admire it. An intern at the foundation once asked if it was the same pen I had used to sign the original papers when the foundation started. Yes, I said, and it struck me then that objects carry narrative like freckles carry history. The pen kept my hand honest. When I signed checks for scholarship disbursements, the scratch upon the paper sounded like a promise. And then, one evening in late October, we had a quiet reckoning that felt like autumn should feel. Brisk, necessary, and somehow cleansing. The three of us sat at our kitchen table after a day of meetings and rehearsals. Emily had made a salad with pomegranate seeds, something she learned at a cooking class and insisted on perfecting. Graham apologized. This time not for a specific thing that required correction, but for a pattern he recognized. He was honest about how he had tried to solve a problem he thought was logistical by buying influence. "I thought if I could control the frameworks, I could reduce risk," he said. "I didn't see how much of me was being projected onto you." I told him that control is often a camouflage for fear. He listened without defense. "Teach me," he said, which is one of the bravest requests someone can offer. Not to be forgiven so much as to be taught how to be better. So we did the work. It was not a single act of contrition, and then happily ever after. It was a series of small, daily choices. He took the time to meet the program staff by name and to learn the kids' stories. He asked Ruth 10 questions he had to look up answers to later. He learned the names of donors, and more importantly, the reasons they gave. For her part, Emily practiced the art of setting expectations without ironclad verdicts. She would call me sometimes at night during the week and say, "He tried something and caught himself," like a mother reporting that her child pulled back from the edge of a pool under their own steam. Those reports strangely were more moving than grand apologies. The community responded to the steadiness. One of the boys from the bike program, Marcus, won a scholarship to a vocational high school and wrote me a hand-lettered note that said, simply, "Thank you for the lane." He came to the winter fundraiser and spoke about how learning to fix a bicycle made him believe his hands could build something that would last. That is the kind of thank you that sits in your heart like a warm stone. Sometimes, in the quiet of my apartment, I would take down the pantry letter and read it again. It did not read like a manifesto. It read like the voice was on a fold, gentle, a little wry, anchored by years. The letter reminded me of what I had become willing to do to protect what was important. Not to cut people off from each other, but to build guardrails around what we loved so that no one could claim our love as leverage. A year later, at a small ceremony at the community center, we announced the inaugural David Bennett Scholarship for Civic Service. Emily gave a short speech about the way her father had taught her to count change and to count people, and Graham stood behind her, hands folded, watching like a man learning how to be proud of someone else's generosity. He had, by then, developed a habit of showing up where it mattered rather than orchestrating the view from afar. Afterwards, at the reception, in a room with fold-out chairs and a porta-potty that had been a minor logistical nightmare, he pulled me aside and handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a pen. Not the sleek one, but a sturdy fountain pen, engraved with the foundation's name. "For when you forget what your hand can do," he said, and I understood it as an attempt to close the circle. I took it with both hands, like someone accepting a map. I did not need the pen. I already had my cracked one that fit my thumb perfectly. But I placed the new pen next to it on my desk, because sometimes a tool is also a truce. It is not about arms being laid down. It is about instruments being shared in honest ways. Months passed, and it became possible to imagine the tent in East Hampton as a place where something important had happened. Not because of the drama, but because its awkwardness forced a better plan. The Peacock's Cry faded into a story told at holiday tables. Whitaker and Comer eventually assigned us a representative who understood that some clients prefer clarity to charm. She learned how to ask questions instead of arranging flowers. Not everyone changed. Some old friends observed our choices and politely offered criticism the way people offer umbrellas they never use. I learned to let polite umbrellas be exactly that. The pantry letter remained taped there until a spring afternoon when I took it down and, with Ruth beside me, rewrote it into something more open. A charter for how I wanted to live my life with the people I loved. It started with the sentence that had once been a private prayer taped to a shelf, "Your blessing is not ink," and ended with specific instructions about who could access what in the event I could not decide for myself. We copied it and gave a sealed version to Ruth to keep in a safe deposit box, and another to Emily with a note. "Remember, always, the room you occupy." I keep the salt packet in my bag. It is ridiculous and irreverently useful. At a fundraiser, I once met a woman who had been widowed young and had become one of my most persistent supporters. She looked at the salt crinkling in my tote and laughed until she cried. "It's the most beautiful superstition I've ever seen," she said. She was right. Sometimes the most human things are tiny gestures that make a life feel a little less precarious. If there is a moral to all of this, it is not simply that boundaries are useful or that lawyers are necessary. It is that love, when uncoupled from control, becomes a practice. It is feeding someone when they are hungry, yes, but it is also refusing to let hunger be manufactured so that you will be the one to feed them. It is teaching your child how to say no and cheering when they do. It is knowing the difference between keeping someone safe and keeping them small. When I sign checks now, when I put my name on documents that fund schools and bike shops and scholarships, the scratch of my pen sounds like the beginning of something steady. I have learned that the measure of legacy is not the sum displayed in a ledger, but the rooms you create where people can learn to fix their own bikes and trust their own hands. The pen in my pocket is not a weapon. It is a compass. So when people ask me how it felt to refuse a pen under a tent, I tell them that I felt exactly what I am feeling now. Less afraid and more whole. I tell them that love does not require erasure. I tell them that the ring I keep close to my skin is not a chain, but a planet. One that orbits what matters because it grew there. I tell them that the salt packet is absurd and perfect, and that sometimes rituals are the bones of the life you want to keep. If you found something in this account that resonates, if you have ever had to choose your own room, or teach someone how to be family, or sign a paper that felt like a promise, please leave a comment below telling me what small thing helped you hold your line. If my story moved you, a like helps these stories find the people who need them, and if you want to hear more about mistakes that became lessons, about lemon bars that heal arguments, about ordinary courage, please subscribe. I'm Margaret Bennett, and I keep my pen with me because decisions are, more than anything, the quiet work of love.